Hey, right, getting there, guys, getting there. Right, law and order, so we'll try and cover that all in one. Okay, problems. The new towns created by the railways, this leads to lawlessness. They're known as like these hell on wheels because it's violent. You're going to have shootouts. This is the wild kind of side of the Western Americas. Most of them were cow towns. You've got these cowboys coming up with the long drive, and then, you know, they're just rough and ready and want to fight, basically. So, let's have a look at the different factors that cause lawlessness. You've got weapons, everybody's armed. Um, they will quickly go to the gun. Economic factors, conflict between cowboys and townspeople, homesteaders and ranchers, miners and hunters, sheep herders and ranchers, cattle barons and smaller ranchers. This is clashing. Code of the West, it's like survival of the fittest almost. If you shot someone in self-defense, then you had not broken the law, as long as the other person was armed too. So you have these shootouts. Geographical, so it's just so big, and there's no law and order to really kind of protect you. Political factors, so they're basically um, you've got the law courts being dominated by the rich and powerful. Social factors as well, so you've got racism being involved there. There's an allure with the Wild West as well. You've got these dime novels appearing in 1860s that are quite successful. Stories are exaggerated. You've got the frontier heroes. It's got this. Oh, sorry. Well, I didn't mean to do that. You can read the dime novels things for yourselves. Anyway, this is just a bit more information on the problems of law and order. Have a look at people like Wild Bill, the Abilene Return to Lawlessness. Wild Bill Hickok was appointed a marshal, commanded fear and respect. So have a look at like who was required to come in and deal with this. Look at the Civil War. So, Civil War had a massive impact because the arrival of large numbers of ex-soldiers in the West after the war, gangs of outlaws were made up of former soldiers. Many of those were traumatized by the war, unable to find work in peacetime. Outlaws who were former Confederate soldiers might also be resentful towards the government. You got the Reno Gang, who were Civil War deserters, con men, thieves who terrorized communities. So you've got good characters that talk about it. Okay, so what solutions do they have? Again, you've got the U.S. Marshals, judges, local government, town marshals, sheriffs, Texas Rangers, and the non-government solutions, the Pinkertons, detective agencies, vigilantism. So have a look at how this solved the problem. Again, it was just ways of dealing with lawlessness in the West. Problem of law and order continue to be an issue. Use of resources between ranchers and homesteaders. We probably guessed that we're going to be getting into the range wars here. Conflict between different races. The Plains Indians and whites. You've got the code of the West again. This honor. Most Westerners carry guns, so it would lead to a shootout. Geographical factors. I know I've banged on about that, but it's still very important. Transportation slow to get to the West, so Lee means you can kind of get away with things. Again, the new mining towns springing up. Again, I've kind of discussed all that, so you can pause and go look through that if you want. Right, Billy the Kid, let's look at our characters. So Billy, he grows up in mining camps in New Mexico, never held down a steady job. When he was 14, 15, he gets into trouble stealing butter. More thefts follow for Billy. He engages in cattle rustling. Basically, you nick cattle and sell them. He became notorious for being able to escape jails. He's involved in the Lincoln County War, basically a conflict of resources between cattle baron John Chisholm, who had a big ranch in New Mexico, and settlers and other ranchers who were desperate for land. Opposition to Chisholm gathered around a rancher called Murphy. Conflict broke out on two sides. Billy on the side fighting against Murphy. Uh, Basically, this leads to his private war. So it ended when Murphy was killed, but again, Billy swore to kill everyone responsible for the death of a friend in the war. So he and his gang had many hideouts around the county and a lot of support from local Mexican people. Then you get the law and order. So local ranchers appealed to the president to end the violence in New Mexico. He appointed a new governor, a sheriff, who was elected with the job of bringing Billy to justice. This is Pat Garrett. Garrett basically tracks him down, brought him to court, judge sentenced him to death, but Billy kind of gets out. Garrett tracks him down again and ends up killing him. So Billy was notorious thief and murderer, but he was seen as an exciting, reckless, romantic figure by many. Newspapers and cheap novels told stories about him. He really lifted the powerless people who wanted to be like Billy, the way he stood against the big northern businesses. Most of his involvement in violence was hired gun. You get the justice system called into question as well. It's just a little bit of Billy, I've gone over that. Right, we've also got Wyatt Earp and the OK Corral. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Wyatt Earp. So in the cow towns, these cowboys would spend their money on drinking and dancing, gambling, and prostitutes. Their wild, drunken behaviours not really appreciated by the northern businessmen who would come to the cow towns to make money. It was these businessmen who wanted sheriffs and marshals in the towns to keep order. They selected men like Wyatt Earp, who had like a really tough personality for this. Basically, Wyatt Earp, I'm going to read through a story, right, of Wyatt Earp, so it's useful to be an example. So Wyatt Earp, when he becomes a lawman after facing down Ridey cowboys. So Earp first got into law enforcement in May 1874. He was involved in a fight in a cow town in Wichita and was arrested. Just then, a rowdy group of cowboys started making trouble in the town. Earp helped the deputy marshal to restore order, and the mayor of Wichita offered him the job of deputy marshal. Earp moved on to be marshal in Dodge City until 1879, at which point he moved to Tombstone, Arizona Territory. So Tombstone's where basically the conflict between the big businessmen and ranchers kind of escalates. So Tombstone was a boom town and was controlled by rich mine owners and businessmen. Against them was a faction of ranchers and cowboys, mostly from Texas. It led to two ranching families, the Clantons and McClorys, in 1880. The rich businessmen hired Wyatt Earp basically as a deputy sheriff to bring order to the town. Now, there's going to be clashes between the Earps, so Wyatt had his two brothers with him, and the Clantons and McClorys, as the lawmen basically tried to recover stolen horses and mules. The cowboys made more trouble through 1881, rustling cattle and robbing stagecoaches. Rumours spread that the Earps had been involved in the stagecoach robberies too. So the Earps and their supporters, though, strongly denied it. And now the Earps, this is going to lead to a gunfight. In a gunfight in 26th of October 1881 near Tombstone's OK Corral, the Earps killed Tom and Frank McClory and Billy Clanton. Virgil Earp, the city marshal, claimed that he had intended only to disarm the men, but they opened fire first. Some townspeople kind of doubted his story because the Earps were very rough and ready, and they think, right, maybe they aimed to just go and kill them straight up. Trouble continued with the cowboys, shooting Virgil and killing Morgan Earp in 1882. Wyatt shot the two men he claimed were responsible for killing his brother. Opinion turned against the Earps. Their violent approach to law keeping had only caused more conflict, and Wyatt had become a murderer with no regard for the law. Wyatt and his brothers were basically forced to flee Tombstone. So that's just a little bit about Earp. It's a good example of the roughness of this of Tombstone and the difficulty with keeping law and order, and the sheriffs themselves being linked to lawlessness. Now, I'm going to talk you through another story of basically the range wars. I think it's really important. So again, there is stuff on there that you can pause and read for yourself. But if you don't want to read for yourself, I'm going to read out the full story. So the background to this. The armed conflicts between different factions for control of land in the West are known as these range wars. After the range, the wide open plains land that cattle roamed across, the best known of all the range wars was this Johnson County War. The Johnson County War was a range war between the cattle barons on one side and homesteaders and small ranchers on the other. It is significant because it shows that the West, even in the 1890s, still had places where men took the law into their own hands. Now, tensions start to generate in Wyoming in 1870. So there were only 9,000 US citizens in the whole of Wyoming Territory, and almost all the land was owned by the government. The Union Pacific Railroad crossed the south of Wyoming in the late 1860s. Through the 1870s, the huge cattle ranches developed. Rich investors, many of them British, financed the ranches. As the population of the territory increased, wealthy, respectable cattlemen were appointed to all the key positions in government and the judges. But the winter of 86, 87, remember the Great Die-Up, how we can connect these, that caused terrible losses to their herds. The power and influence of the big ranchers starts to shake. Now, small ranchers did a lot better, although the big ranchers kind of suspect that this was because they had stolen many of their cows. Rustling had been a problem for many years, so basically the big ranchers are thinking the smaller ranchers only came out of the Great Die-Up better because they stole their cows. Basically, the big ranchers, they used their association, the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, the WSGA, to ban small ranchers that they suspected of rustling from their spring roundup. Although the big ranchers were rich and powerful, ordinary people, homesteaders and small ranchers, were tired of the way they always grabbed everything for themselves. As a result, juries made up of ordinary people would almost never convict someone accused of rustling by the big ranchers. Big ranchers began to discuss taking the law into their own hands. So, this leads to the killing of Ella and Jim Averill. Ella and Jim, they farmed a homestead of 670 acres in the middle of an open range pasture used by cattleman Albert Bothwell. Although Ella and Jim had their legal claim to the land, Bothwell wanted them gone. Disputes flared, and Jim wrote a letter to a local newspaper denouncing ranchers as nothing but rich land grabbers. In 1889, Ella obtained a small herd of cattle. Bothwell and his men accused her of stealing his cows, seized both Ella and Jim, and hanged them. Soon after, Bothwell took over the land and Ella's cattle too. Other killings and murder attempts followed, leaving 3 owners of small ranches dead. The homesteaders and small ranchers established their own association in 1892 and decided they would hold their own roundup a month before the WSGA GAs. This way, they would claim all that spring's unbranded new calves for themselves. So this is where the conflict kind of begins. The WSGA, they had enough. It planned a full-scale invasion of Johnson County to kill 70 men who should die for the good of the country. This plan made with the full knowledge of Wyoming's governor. The wealthy cattlemen raised a fund of $100,000 to carry it out, most of which was intended for legal fees after the killings were done. The WSGA hired 22 Texas gunmen and paid them $5 a day plus expenses, with a bonus of $50 for every rustler they killed. They were brought into Wyoming on a train specially supplied by the Union Pacific Railroad Company. Despite being well armed and supplied, the invaders failed in their mission. Learning that 2 men from their hit list, Nate Champion and his partner Nick Ray, were at the KC Ranch, they abandoned their original plan and attacked the ranch instead. Nate held them off all day, and the ranch sturdy log basically from the ranch's sturdy log cabin. When the invaders set fire to the cabin, Nate ran for it but was shot down. Word reached Sheriff Angus of Johnson County, who quickly raises a force of 40 men and went after the invaders. Outraged, citizens of Buffalo, Johnson County's main town, also joined the resistance. When a newspaper reporter asked one of them if this was because he was a rustler, the man said, "No, but I'm fighting for my home and property." The invaders fortified themselves at the TA Ranch, surrounded by 300 angry Johnson County residents, until the US 6th Cavalry arrived and saved them. So, this leads us to the trial. The invaders had powerful friends: the state governor, the judge, the Wyoming US Marshal, and 2 US senators supported the WSGA and its plan to end rustling. The governor had requested that troops be sent to the TA Ranch to prevent further bloodshed, and the troops then took the invaders away from Johnson County, despite the protests of Sheriff Angus. They were then taken out of the county to Fort Fetterman in case citizens tried to lynch them. The best Chicago lawyers were hired by the WSGA to defend the invaders, backed by a $100,000 fund. The lawyers convinced the judge that it was impossible for their clients to have a fair trial in Johnson County. The trial was moved to Cheyenne, the state capital. Jury members here were more likely to favor rich, respectable men over a bunch of rustlers. Knowing that Johnson County was short of money, the lawyers extended the trial as much as they could until the prosecutors had run out of money. Once the prosecution could no longer afford the trial costs, the charges against the accused had to be dropped. Now, why is that significant at the Johnson County War? Well, basically, vigilante justice had been central to frontier solutions to the problems of law and order throughout the 19th century. What is more surprising is not the rich cattlemen decided it was a good idea to kill 70 men, but that so many people thought that was wrong. Reducing tensions, so there were fewer tensions when both farms and ranches fenced off their land and when ranches were based on the same property rights that homesteads were. This could not happen under the open range system, but after the winter of 1886 to 87, most cattlemen moved to small ranches with fenced-in winter pastures. So it ends basically the open range, and that's the story of the Johnson County War. Right, big question, but if you look over and know the story, you'll be fine. All right, guys, I'll leave it there.